The morning Lord Edmund Ashford rode out to survey the eastern pastures, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down from the hills in long, cold sweeps that bent the grass flat and sent the cattle drifting toward the low stone walls at the field's edge. He had ridden these fields since he was a boy, back when his father sat in the hall, and the Ashford estate stretched twice as far as it did now, before debts and drought and poor harvests had carved it down to something more modest, more manageable, and considerably more humbling for a man of his station. Edmund was 34 years old, unmarried, and alone in a house that had been built for a family of 12. He kept 6 house servants, a steward named Hollies who was honest but growing old, and until 3 days ago, a herdsman named Breckett who had managed the cattle since before Edmund inherited the estate. Breckett had broken his leg falling from a hay loft, and the bone had snapped badly enough that the physician from town said the man would not walk without a cane for the rest of his life, let alone chase cattle across rough pasture. So Edmund Ashford, Baron of Ashford, had ridden out himself on a gray Tuesday morning to look at 43 head of longhorn cattle wandering across 200 acres of unfenced land, and he had admitted to himself, quietly and without the drama he generally avoided, that he had a serious problem. He had posted notices in the village of Callan, which sat 3 miles down the valley road, and was the nearest settlement of any size. The notices asked for an experienced hand familiar with cattle work, someone who could start immediately and who had strong references. He had expected applications from the sort of men who usually came for such work, broad, shouldered, slose, spoken, smelling of earth and animals, men who understood the rhythms of herding without needing much instruction. He had not expected the girl. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon while Edmund was reviewing accounts with Hollies in the study, and Mrs. Perrin, his housekeeper, came to the door with an expression on her face that suggested she had already formed an opinion about the visitor, and that opinion was not entirely favorable. She told him that a young woman had come about the herdsman position. Edmund asked her to repeat that, because he thought he had misheard. Mrs. Perrin repeated it with the careful pronunciation of someone who has no intention of being blamed for whatever happens next. Edmund set down his quill and went to the front hall. The girl standing in his entrance hall was perhaps 20 years old, though she might have been older. There was a quality to her stillness that suggested someone who had learned early to present less than she possessed. She was of medium height, lean in the way of people who work physically and eat practically, with dark hair pulled back under a flat, brimmed hat that she held in both hands. Her clothes were plain working clothes, worn but clean, and her boots were the most interesting thing about her. Good leather, well oiled, with the kind of wear on the heels and inner edges that came from years of riding. She looked at him with steady brown eyes and did not appear nervous in the slightest, which Edmund found either impressive or impertinent, and he hadn't yet decided which. Her name was Clara Voss. Her father had run a horse farm in the northern counties until his death 2 years prior, at which point the farm had passed to an uncle who had no particular interest in it, and had sold it within a season. She had worked the horses since she could walk, she said, and the cattle her father had kept alongside them since she was old enough to be useful. She had spent the past 2 years working wherever work could be found, 2 seasons on a sheep station near the coast, a winter helping a farrier outside the city, a summer driving cattle on a large estate in the Midlands before the owner's son had decided he could manage without her, and had been mistaken about that in ways she did not elaborate on. She had references, she said, and produced them from an inside coat pocket. 3 letters, all written in different hands, all saying variations of the same thing, that Clara Voss was the most capable handler of horses and cattle they had encountered, that she worked without complaint, that she was reliable and trustworthy, and that they were sorry to lose her in each case for reasons that had nothing to do with her performance. Edmund read all 3 letters standing in his own hallway, while the girl waited with the patience of someone who understood that decisions needed time and did not intend to rush his. When he finished, he looked up at her and said, with the directness that had always been his preferred mode of communication, that the work was demanding, that it involved long days in all weather, that he had 3 head of longhorn that needed managing across rough terrain, and that the cottage that came with the position was small but sound. He did not ask whether she was sure. He had the sense that asking Clara Voss whether she was sure about something she had already committed to would be a waste of both their time. She started the following morning. Edmund had instructed Hollies to show her the pastures and introduce her to the cattle, which was the usual arrangement when a new hand started. But when he rode out at mid-morning to see how things were progressing, he found Hollies standing at the gate of the south field with his arms crossed and an expression of profound bewilderment on his face, watching Clara Voss on the back of the estate's working horse, a large, somewhat temperamental bay named Soldier that Becket had always ridden with a cautious hand, cutting a stray longhorn away from the herd's edge with a precision and economy of motion that made it look effortless. She rode without visible effort, the reins loose, her weight shifting in the saddle with a naturalness that Edmund had seen in perhaps 3 or 4 riders in his entire life, and he had grown up around horses. Soldier, who regularly made life difficult for anyone who tried to push him into quick lateral movement, was responding to her with something close to enthusiasm. She told me I needn't bother showing her the land, Hollies said, without looking away from the field. Said she'd walk it herself. I offered to saddle Soldier for her, and she'd already done it. I see, Edmund said. She asked me if there were any spots where the cattle tend to drift when the weather comes from the north. I told her about the gap in the west wall near the old oak. She thanked me and rode off. Hollies paused. I've been watching for about half an hour. I can't find anything to correct. Edmund watched for a while longer without comment. The longhorn were settled in a way they had not been in the 3 days since Becket's accident, calm, grouped without being crowded, moving in the unhurried, contented manner of animals that feel properly managed. Clara Voss moved among them with the horse and occasionally on foot, reading their movements and responding before anything became a problem. It was, Edmund thought, very good work. He rode back to the house without speaking to her, because there didn't seem to be anything useful to say, and because he had the feeling not unpleasant, but unfamiliar, that his presence was entirely unnecessary in that field. Over the following weeks, the estate settled into a new rhythm. The cattle were healthier than they had been in some time. Clara had identified early signs of foot rot in 2 of the animals and treated them before the condition spread, had repaired 3 gaps in the eastern wall that Becket had apparently been meaning to get to for some months, and had reorganized the feeding schedule in a way that Hollies admitted, somewhat grudgingly, made considerably more sense than what they'd been doing before. She was almost invisible in the way that people are when they are doing their jobs so well that the job itself disappears. Edmund saw her in the mornings when he rode out to the fields, and occasionally in the evenings when he walked the property's edge, and they exchanged the brief practical conversations of employer and employee. This cow was off her feed. That section of the north pasture was getting overworked and needed to rest. There was a problem with the water channel that fed the lower trough. But Edmund was a man who had lived alone for 6 years, since his father died and left him the estate and the title and the silence of a large house that no one else occupied, and solitude had made him more observant than he might otherwise have been. He noticed things. He noticed that she read in the evenings he could see lamplight in the cottage window long after dark, and once when he passed closer he could see her shape through the glass with a book held open on her knee. He noticed that she had an opinion about everything and expressed it plainly when asked, and not at all when not asked, which he respected. He noticed that she was kind to the animals in a manner that was practical rather than sentimental. She did not name the cattle or make pets of them, but she handled them with a consistent gentleness that they responded to, and when a calf was born early on a cold night and struggled to stand, she stayed in the field until nearly dawn to make sure it survived. He learned that last detail from Holly's, not from her, because Clara Voss was not given to reporting her own efforts. He found himself riding out to the fields more than was strictly necessary. This was something he noticed about himself and examined with the honesty he tried to apply to most things, and he concluded that his ostensible reasons, checking on the cattle, reviewing the pasture conditions, ensuring everything was in order, were accurate as far as they went, but did not entirely account for the frequency of the visits. When she was in the field, he found reasons to stay and talk. Their conversations, which had begun as purely practical, expanded slowly and without either of them apparently directing the expansion into other territory. She asked him once why the eastern pastures were underused given that the grass was better there, and he explained about the drainage problem that made it impassable in wet weather, and that led to a conversation about the original design of the estate's water channels, which led to a discussion of the land's history, and somehow an hour had passed without Edmund being sure how. She knew a great deal about the natural management of land, not from books, she said, but from watching, from years of paying attention to what the land itself seemed to want to do. Her father had taught her that the best farming worked with the landscape rather than against it. Edmund thought about that for several days afterward. She asked him once, directly, why he had not hired another man. The estate's reputation in Callan was good, and there would have been applicants with experience, she said, and she did not ask this with any apparent anxiety about her position, but with the straightforward curiosity she applied to most things. Edmund said that her references had been the strongest of any he received. She looked at him with those steady eyes and said that that might be true, but it hadn't been the only reason, and he could tell she was asking whether he'd taken a chance on her out of some impulse toward fairness or charity, neither of which she wanted. He said, no, it was the references and the manner in which she'd presented herself, and if there had been any hesitation on his part, it had been foolish, and he'd recognized it as such before she'd finished speaking in the hallway. She seemed satisfied with that, and went back to what she was doing. There was a morning in the 5th week when everything shifted, though neither of them acknowledged it in any direct way at the time. Edmund had ridden out early because there was a report of a problem at the north wall. Several of the younger Longhorn had apparently found a weakness in the stonework and were testing it, and he arrived to find Clara already there, and also to find the young Callan farmer named Reed, who owned the land adjacent to Ashford's northern boundary, sitting on his horse at the other side of the wall, looking at Clara with an expression that Edmund did not immediately categorize, but did immediately dislike. Reed was in his late 20s, broad and fair, with the self-assurance of a man who was well liked in his community and knew it. He had a habit of speaking to women in a particular tone that managed to be both agreeable and faintly condescending, as if every woman he spoke to was a pleasant surprise. He was speaking to Clara in that tone now, telling her that the wall was Ashford's responsibility to maintain, and that she ought to tell her employer that the boundary needed attention. Clara was looking at the wall and not at Reed, pressing her hand along the loose stones with the methodical focus of someone cataloging a problem, and she said without looking up that she was aware it needed attention and was currently attending to it. Reed said, with a chuckle that seemed intended to be charming, that it was unusual work for a girl. Clara said that the stones didn't seem to find it unusual. Edmund, arriving at that moment, found himself suppressing something that might have been a smile. He greeted Reed, and they exchanged the civil, slightly guarded pleasantries of neighboring landowners with no serious disputes but no particular warmth. And Reed said he'd heard Breck, it was laid up, and that Ashford had hired he paused a girl for the work. He said this with a slight emphasis that implied he was waiting for Edmund to confirm what must surely be a misunderstanding, or at least a temporary arrangement. Edmund said that he had hired the most qualified applicant, and that the cattle were in excellent condition, and left it at that. What happened next was not something Edmund had planned or anticipated. Reed, apparently deciding to demonstrate something, looked at Clara and said that since they were all here, perhaps she could help him move his own small herd back from the boundary. 3 of his cattle had drifted close to the wall, and he'd need someone to turn them. And he said this in the way of a man who expects help to be offered promptly and gratefully. Clara looked at him. She looked at Edmund. Edmund said nothing, because he understood immediately that this was not a moment that required him to say anything. Clara walked to Soldier, who was tethered 20 feet away, untied him without saddling him. She'd been working on foot that morning, and swung onto his bare back in a single motion that was so fluid and unconsidered that it seemed almost leisurely. She rode him at a collected canter around the end of the accessible wall section, came up behind Reed's 3 drifted cattle with the diagonal approach that pushes animals sideways rather than triggering a straight run, and moved them back with 4 or 5 precise shifts of Soldier's body, the horse responding to pressure from her legs alone, until all 3 cattle were well back from wall and grouped with Reed's main herd. The whole thing took perhaps 3 minutes. She rode back at a walk, slid off Soldier without ceremony, and went back to examining the wall. Reed was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was very fine riding. Clara said thank you without looking up. Reed looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Reed. Something passed between them that did not require words. Reed understood, Edmund thought, that he had misjudged something considerably, and he had the grace to look slightly abashed about it. He thanked them both and rode back toward his own land, and Edmund watched him go with a feeling of quiet satisfaction that he tried not to let show. He asked Clara, when Reed was out of earshot, where she had learned to ride bareback with that level of control. She said her father had believed that anyone who needed a saddle to communicate with a horse didn't understand horses. She had ridden bareback until she was 10 and only used a saddle for long work after that, and by then the communication was already established. She said this simply as a fact and went back to the wall, and Edmund stood there a moment longer than he needed to. The weeks continued. Autumn deepened and the hills went gold and brown, and the cattle needed bringing closer to the sheltered lower fields as the weather changed. Clara managed the transition with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and Edmund began to understand that what he had initially perceived as simply good work was something more specific. It was genuine expertise, the kind that grows only from years of close attention and real love for the work itself. She understood cattle the way a musician understands music, not as a set of rules to be applied, but as a living language to be listened to. He told her this once, feeling slightly foolish saying it, and she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize, and said that was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to her. About it, he started bringing books out to the field. Not for any declared reason, he simply found that he was reading in the evenings with less attention than usual, and that the hours he spent near the fields were the hours when he felt most fully present in his own life, and so he brought the books to the fields and read while she worked, and sometimes they talked about what he was reading, and sometimes they didn't. She borrowed one, a natural history he'd been working through, and returned it a week later with 2 pages of careful notes tucked inside, observations about where its descriptions of cattle behavior matched and diverged from what she saw in practice. He read her notes 3 times. He told Hollis, carefully, casually, that Miss Voss had an interesting analytical mind. Hollis looked at him for a moment and then said, "Yes, sir, she does," with the tone of a man who is too old and too wise to point out what is being communicated in this observation. It was Hollis, in fact, who told Edmund something he had not known. The old steward mentioned one afternoon, apparently in passing while discussing the estate's accounts, that Clara Voss had grown up on the Northfield horse farm, which Edmund might know by reputation. Edmund did know it. Anyone in the county who cared about horses knew the Northfield farm. It had produced some of the finest working horses in the region for 30 years under a man named Thomas Voss, who had been widely regarded as one of the great horsemen of his generation. Thomas Voss had been careful and exceptional and largely uninterested in fame, and he had died at 50, 2 from a fever, and the farm had been broken up, and his daughter had gone to find work where she could. Edmund sat with this information for a long time. He thought about what it meant to be that person, to have grown up in the middle of genuine excellence, to have been formed by it, and then to have watched it simply dissolve because the world did not particularly care about preserving what was good and valuable when money offered a simpler solution. He thought about Clara arriving at his door with her hat in her hands and her 3 letters and her steady eyes, and he felt something that was close to anger on her behalf, and also something he recognized, with the honesty he tried to apply to himself, as gratitude that she had come here, that the dissolving of what should have been preserved had sent her in this direction, to this field, to this conversation. He was in the field with her on an afternoon in late October when the first real winter storm came early and fast off the mountains, the sky going dark in an hour and the temperature dropping hard. They were both far out in the north pasture when the rain hit, and they pushed the cattle south together with the efficient, unspoken coordination of people who had worked alongside each other long enough that communication had become something almost physical. She moved, he countered, the cattle flowed south in a loose mass, and Soldier worked between them with the focused energy of a horse that understands purpose. They got the animals into the lower shelter field and closed the gate as the storm broke properly, rain coming sideways and cold, and they stood on the inside of the gate looking at the settled cattle, and they were both soaked through. She was laughing. It startled him, not because she was generally humorless, but because it was the first time he had heard her laugh freely, without restraint, the way people laugh when something has been hard and has also been perfectly managed, and the relief and the satisfaction and the absurdity of standing soaked in a field in an October storm combine into something that comes out as laughter. He found himself laughing too. They stood in the rain laughing at nothing and at everything, at the cattle looking affronted by the weather, at the speed with which the sky had changed, at themselves, and when the laughter settled she turned and looked at him with an openness he hadn't seen before. The careful measurement usually present in her expression had been washed away, temporarily, by the storm and exertion and the shared satisfaction of work well done. He said, because the moment seemed to allow it, that he was glad she had come. He meant it in the direct, practical sense, glad she had applied, glad he had hired her, glad the work was going well. But he heard, as he said it, that the words also held what he had been thinking for some weeks and had been careful not to think too directly about, which was that he was glad she had come in broader and more complicated sense, that the house felt less silent, that the days had a different quality, that he looked for her in the mornings before he was fully aware of doing it. She was quiet for a moment, rain running down her face, and then she said that she was glad too. And there was the same duality in her words that had been in his, the practical truth and the other truth beside it, and they both understood both truths had been spoken. They walked back to the house because the storm made remaining in the field pointless, and Mrs. Perrin met them at the door with towels and an expression of resigned disapproval at their state, and Edmund insisted Clara come inside and warm herself before walking back to the cottage, and they sat in the kitchen with tea and the fire going, and Mrs. Perrin, having expressed her views on people who stand in storms when they don't have to, left them alone with the practicality of a woman who has worked in a household for 20 years and has learned when to absent herself. They talked for 2 hours, not about the cattle, not about the estate, not about practical things. She talked about her father, about the farm, about what it had been like to grow up surrounded by horses that were treated as individuals with personalities and preferences and particular strengths. About the first time she had taken a horse bareback over a 4-foot fence at the age of 8, and her father had watched from the gate and said nothing for a long moment, and then said only, "Again." And she had done it again. She talked about the years since his death with a straightforwardness that did not ask for pity, and did not minimize what they had been: hard, uncertain, often lonely, sustained by the work itself, and the knowledge that she was very good at it, even when the world seemed determined not to value that properly. Edmund listened without interrupting. He had a tendency, in conversations he cared about, to be too ready with his own thoughts, and he made himself be quiet and listen, and it was worth it. He talked about his own loneliness, because she had been honest, and honesty felt like the right response. He talked about inheriting the estate at 28 and finding himself in charge of something that had always seemed large and secure, and was actually both smaller and more fragile than it appeared, and about the way the house felt at night in winter when the wind came down from the hills, and there were only 6 people in it, rattling around under high ceilings built for a different era and a different kind of life. He said that he had grown accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to most things, and he wasn't sure whether that accustoming was a good thing or a form of giving up on something. She thought about this carefully, the way she did with most things, and said that she thought there was a difference between accepting circumstances and accepting that the circumstances couldn't change, and that the first was wisdom, and the second was a story you told yourself when you were tired. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire crackled, and the storm pressed at the windows, and somewhere in the house a door shifted in its frame. He said carefully that he didn't want to say something that would make her position here uncomfortable, because she was good at her work, and he valued her as his herdsman, and he didn't want her to feel that her position required her to respond in any particular way to anything he might say. She looked at him with the expression that he had come to understand was her version of patience, not passive, but active waiting. He said that he had been thinking about her rather more than was strictly professional for the last several weeks, and that he thought she deserved to know that, plainly, with no expectation attached to the knowledge. She was quiet for long enough that he began to compose a retraction, a way of stepping back from the admission that would leave them both their dignity. Then she said that she had been thinking about him too, and that she had been trying to work out whether it was the kind of thinking that came from proximity and circumstance, or the kind that came from something more specific to the person, and that she had concluded it was the second kind, which she had decided to do nothing about because she was his employee, and she was not going to be the person who created a complication in the one stable position she'd had in 2 years. She said this with the directness she brought to everything, and it was one of the finest things anyone had ever said to Edmund Ashford, not because of the content, but because of the quality of honesty it represented, the kind of honesty that acknowledges what you feel and what you chose to do about it and why, all at the same time. The winter came fully in November, and the pastures frosted, and the cattle grew their heavy coats, and the days shortened until there were only a few hours of light to work in. Edmund and Clara worked alongside each other in the fields more often than was strictly necessary. He had taken up tasks that were genuinely the herdsman's work, and she had not told him to leave, which was all the permission either of them required. They ate together sometimes in the evenings, in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, because the kitchen had the fire, and because neither of them had any interest in formality. Mrs. Perrin accepted this development with the magnificent practicality of someone who has been waiting for the house to acquire a specific kind of warmth for quite some time. There were still days when he was aware of the awkwardness of the situation as others would see it, a baron and his hired girl, the asymmetry of money and position and social standing. He thought about this and talked about it with her directly, because he had learned that direct conversation was the only kind she had much use for. She said that she was aware of what people in Callan would make of it, and that she had decided what other people made of things was a factor to be considered and then set aside, because a life lived primarily for the approval of Callan's general opinion would be a very small life. Edmund said that he thought she was the most sensible person he had ever met. She said that sensible was a word people used when they meant something else, and he said that yes, it was, and they understood each other. He asked her in December whether she would consider managing the estate's horses as well as the cattle, because the estate's equine management had been handled by a rotating series of inadequate arrangements since the previous master left, and the horses would be better served by someone who knew what she was doing. She looked at him and said that would be a significant expansion of her responsibilities, and would presumably come with a commensurate change in her position. He said that yes, it would. She said what position exactly did he have in mind? He said he had several thoughts on the subject, and he would very much like to discuss them with her, if she was willing. She said she was. The discussion that followed was, in its way, the most important conversation Edmund Ashford had in his 34 years, and it had the quality of most important things. It was partly practical, and partly profound, and partly very funny, because she had opinions about the formal conventions of such discussions, and expressed them with a dry precision that made him laugh 3 times, and because he knocked over his tea in the middle of it, and she said that he should perhaps be less nervous since she was the one with more at stake, and he said that he very much disagreed with that assessment, and she conceded the point with the fairness she brought to everything. They announced it to the household, and then to the village, and then to the county in the spring, when the pastures were green again, and the cattle were back in the high fields, and Soldier was producing 3 beautiful foals from the mares Clara had selected and managed through the winter with the expertise of someone who had grown up watching the best horseman in the region at work. Reed came to congratulate them, and managed to do it with a good humor that Edmund appreciated, and made some remark about Clara's riding that he intended as a compliment, and that Clara received as one because it was one. There were people in the county who had opinions about the match, and some of those opinions were expressed in ways that reached Edmund's ears, and he found that he minded them less than he would have predicted. Clara minded them not at all, or at least if she did, she had placed that concern in the category of things that existed but did not require significant energy, which was its own form of freedom. She continued to manage the cattle. She expanded her work with the horses until the Ashford estate's equine stock had a reputation in the county that grew steadily over the years that followed, a reputation that people traced back to a change in approach that could not be quite articulated, but that clearly worked, because the horses were extraordinary and everyone could see it. Edmund rode with her in the mornings, not because he needed to supervise anything, but because riding beside Clara Voss in a gray dawn with the hills, dark and the grass wet, and the cattle moving in the low fields was one of the best things he had found in his life, and he was old enough and honest enough to know that you hold on to the best things. The house was less silent. The evenings had a different quality. The fields felt, in a way he could not entirely explain, like they were being properly used for the first time, not just farmed but known, understood, listened to, in the way Clara had learned from her father that land deserved to be. He was grateful for the broken leg that had sent him to post notices in the village, grateful for the girl who had arrived with her hat in her hands and her steady eyes, grateful that he had been sensible enough to read 3 letters carefully and recognize what they actually said, which was not just that she was good at her work, but that she was the kind of person who made everything around her better, who brought a quality of attention and competence and integrity to whatever she did that those around her could not help but be affected by. He had hired a girl to watch his cattle and been unaware, in those first days, of what exactly had walked through his door. He knew now. He had known for a long time. The cattle were fine, the horses were extraordinary, the house was warm, and the mornings were something to look forward to, which is not a small thing, not a small thing at all, and Edmund Ashford, Baron of Ashford, understood this, and was not too proud or too foolish to say so, at least to the one person who needed to hear it, which was enough.